The heat rose in shimmering waves off the Tunisian plain on May 12, 1943, as Private Carlo Benedetti of the Italian 10th Bersaglieri peered over the rim of his foxhole. Dust and diesel smoke filled the horizon. He had grown used to the sight of German panzers, their armor scarred and coughing black fumes, but what rolled across the ridge that morning was something altogether different. American M4 Sherman tanks, broad-shouldered, squat, and endless in number, appeared as if conjured from the earth itself. They came in columns, their engines hammering a steady rhythm like factory presses, their silhouettes so numerous that Benedetti thought for a moment the land itself was moving. The order came down from a weary Italian captain to stack rifles and prepare to surrender. Benedetti's hands shook as he placed his Carcano M91 rifle, a bolt-action weapon with a 6-round clip already worn and fouled with desert grit, onto the growing pile. Just hours earlier he had fired its last cartridges at distant shapes he could barely see through the dust. Now he watched American infantry advance behind their tanks, men armed not with bolt-actions but with M1 Garands, sleek semi-automatics that fired 8 rounds as fast as a man could pull the trigger. The metallic ping of an ejected clip rang out even in the din, a sound he would never forget. Around him, Italian soldiers slumped in defeat. They were not cowards, but exhausted men who had been fighting without proper fuel, spare parts, or rations. Their commanders had promised German reinforcements. Instead, they saw the stars and stripes painted on turret after turret, endless firepower rolling forward while the Luftwaffe was nowhere to be found. The statistics were staggering. By the end of that day, more than 238,000 Axis troops in Tunisia would fall into Allied hands, the single largest capitulation since Stalingrad. Benedetti was one of them, swept up in a tide of surrender that stretched from Tunis to Bizerte. As the sun fell, the prisoners were herded into open-air cages of barbed wire. Benedetti looked across at the American tanks now idling in the twilight, their crews tossing rations to each other casually, like boys on a baseball diamond. The sound of laughter carried over the wire. His stomach clenched with hunger as he caught a whiff of hot coffee being poured from a GI's tin cup. That scent seemed more unreal than the thunder of tanks. The war was not over, but for Benedetti it was finished. He was stepping out of Mussolini's dream and into an American reality that would confound every expectation he had carried to North Africa. Tomorrow he would begin the journey west across an ocean, and toward a revelation that defeat could taste like abundance. The Liberty ship groaned as it pitched through Atlantic swells, its steel hull echoing with the muffled chorus of hundreds of Italian prisoners crammed below decks. Carlo Benedetti lay on a rough bunk, lulled not by comfort but by exhaustion. He had expected chains and starvation. Instead, he was issued 3 daily meals and a wool blanket. Above, American sailors cursed and joked as they manned their posts. The ship carried a cargo far more fragile than tanks or ammunition, human beings who only days before had fought against the flag painted on its stern. The journey itself was a feat of industrial choreography. By 1943, the U.S. had built over 2,700 Liberty ships, each a 441-foot assembly line miracle capable of carrying 10,000 tons or 2,500 troops. Powered by triple expansion steam engines, they were not fast, but they were endless. New hulls sliding down slipways at a rate that once reached 3 ships per day. This convoy, guarded by radar-equipped destroyers, crossed waters that months earlier had been U-boat killing grounds. But Allied shipbuilding now outpaced German torpedo production, and the once feared wolf packs prowled in vain. At dawn on the 12th day, the cry went up, "America!" Benedetti and his comrades pressed to the railings as the gray outline of New York Harbor emerged. The sight seemed impossibly vast, cranes rising like cathedrals, warehouses stacked to the sky, freighters in every berth. And there, towering above the waves, stood the Statue of Liberty. Some of the men wept openly. They had been taught that America was soft, decadent, incapable of true war. Yet here was a city whose very skyline was a declaration of power. As the ship slid into its berth, Benedetti inhaled the sharp tang of coal smoke mixed with a scent he had not smelled in years. Roasted coffee drifting across the docks. American stevedores unloaded crates with casual efficiency. Trucks rumbled in neat columns, each one gleaming with fresh paint. For a man whose army had cannibalized trucks for spare parts and boiled weeds for soup, the abundance struck like a hammer blow. On the dock, U.S. guards herded the POWs into lines. One corporal offered a cigarette from a full pack, an act so small it seemed absurdly generous. Benedetti lit it with shaking hands, the smoke filling his lungs, as if it carried with it the first taste of freedom. He was a prisoner, but already he sensed a strange reversal. Captivity in America might prove less a punishment than an initiation into a world where machines and men worked in harmony, producing plenty beyond imagination. The barbed wire of the camps awaited, but in that moment Benedetti's fear gave way to awe. He had left behind Mussolini's illusions and stepped into the beating heart of industrial democracy. The train rattled across the flat expanse of the Texas Panhandle, a plume of smoke stretching behind as boxcars full of prisoners clattered toward Camp Hereford. For Carlo Benedetti, peering through a narrow slat, the land seemed to go on forever, endless plains under a sky too wide to comprehend. He had been told this was just one of many camps. The numbers were impossible. By war's end, more than 50,000 Italians would be held in America, part of a vast total of 425,000 Axis prisoners scattered from Arizona deserts to New England forests. At Hereford, the gates swung open to reveal barbed wire glinting in the sun, rows of wooden barracks, and a watchtower silhouetted against the horizon. Carlo braced for cruelty. Instead, he found order and, astonishingly, dignity. The Geneva Convention rules were not just words here. They were enforced. Prisoners were issued uniforms marked PW, fed meals that included meat and vegetables, and even allowed canteen privileges. In the evenings, films flickered against makeshift screens, American westerns where heroes rode endlessly across landscapes that now surrounded him. It was not only Hereford. In Indiana, at Camp Atterbury, some 3,000 Italians arrived in April 1943. They were soon working the fields, building chapels, and attending Mass with local parishioners. In Boston, Italian service units labored at the docks, stacking beer and ammunition with military precision. Everywhere, there was a strange consistency. Captors who treated their prisoners as men rather than beasts. The contrast to Axis prison camps in Europe was so stark that veterans would later call their captivity a second home. Brigadier General Calvin DeWitt, overseeing Boston's Quartermaster Depot, described their performance as more than satisfactory, blunt words that masked the reality. Their labor was essential. He had calculated that each Italian working willingly behind barbed wire freed an American GY for the front. Even in captivity, they were part of the Allied war machine. Carlo lay on his bunk one night, the wind rattling the barracks walls, the scent of mesquite drifting through cracks in the wood. He thought of his family in Abruzzo, ration cards, bread lines, and his younger sister's hollow cheeks. Here, in enemy hands, he had eaten better in a week than in months at home. Captivity was not freedom, but it was sustenance, order, and, to his amazement, a glimpse of abundance. As he drifted toward sleep, the projector began to whir in the recreation hall. Tonight's feature was another cowboy picture. Carlo smiled at the irony. Back home, the war had stolen everything. Here, in the land of his enemies, they gave him moving pictures. The story was only beginning. The South Boston Army base pulsed with activity in the summer of 1944. Cargo nets swung from cranes, trucks rumbled in tight columns, and the salty air was thick with the scent of diesel and beer. Among the workers were men in U.S. fatigues bearing a curious insignia, Italy stitched across their shoulders. They were prisoners, but also something more, members of the Italian service units, the unlikely allies America had forged from defeated enemies. After Italy signed the armistice in September 1943 and declared war on Germany a month later, the U.S. faced a question: what to do with tens of thousands of Italian POWs? The answer was ingenious. Screened for loyalty and offered a choice, more than 45,000 out of roughly 51,000 agreed to serve. They swore an oath not to Mussolini, but to the Badoglio government, then donned U.S. uniforms with distinctive patches. These men formed work details of 40 to 250, led by Italian officers but overseen by Americans, a structure that preserved order while multiplying manpower. The statistics told the story. By war's end, Italian service units had contributed more than 90 million man-days of labor, an economic value estimated at $230 million. They worked in depots, hospitals, farms, and ports, replacing American soldiers needed at the front. In Boston, they stacked ammunition bound for Normandy, loaded food supplies, and even handled rail shipments of beer. Boxcars filled to the roof with bottles destined for GIs overseas. To men who had fought with empty bellies, the sheer surplus seemed incomprehensible. General DeWitt acknowledged their role bluntly. Their labor was badly needed. The irony was not lost on the Italians themselves. A year earlier, they had aimed rifles at Americans in North Africa. Now, their hands guided crates of American munitions, fueling the very army that would crush Hitler's Reich. For Carlo Benedetti, the dockyards of Boston were a revelation. He had grown up in a village where horses pulled plows and food was rationed to the ounce. Here, machines lifted entire shiploads as if they weighed nothing. He remembered the day he first saw a convoy of trucks painted with fresh olive drab rolling in endless sequence, each vehicle gleaming, no patchwork repairs, no parts cannibalized. It was abundance not just in food, but in steel and gasoline. At night, when work was finished, Carlo and his fellows returned to their quarters, pockets filled with script from their modest pay. They bought candy, soap, and sometimes cigarettes, marveling that even as prisoners they had choices. They were captives, yet within the arsenal of democracy they had become workers in its colossal machine. On the pier, another ship's horn bellowed, a reminder that their labor was measured not in crates, but in victory. The Texas sun hung low, painting the sky in copper as the prisoners at Camp Hereford shouldered chisels and hammers. Dust swirled across the prairie, stinging eyes and settling into every crease of their wool uniforms. Yet the Italians worked with surprising joy. They were not digging trenches or laying barbed wire. They were raising a chapel, stone by stone, in a land far from home. The idea had begun among a handful of prisoners with construction experience. They requested tools and materials, expecting refusal. Instead, the Americans provided cement, lumber, and even allowed quarrying of local rock. It was a small gesture in the vast machinery of war, but it changed the rhythm of the camp. Prisoners who had once marked their days by roll call and meager diversions now measured time by the rising walls of a sanctuary. For Carlo Benedetti, the work stirred memories of Abruzzo, the village church where his parents had prayed, the bell tower that marked every hour of his childhood. He cut stone with blistered hands. The scent of mesquite carried on the wind, and felt for the first time that captivity could hold meaning. Faith bridged the chasm between victor and vanquished. Local priests visited, offering Mass, while townsfolk marveled at the craftsmanship. Where others saw prisoners, the faithful saw men rebuilding a piece of Italy on American soil. The chapel's walls rose quickly, sturdy and plain, but dignified. Arched windows took shape, sunlight piercing the dust to illuminate the rough-hewn altar. A wooden cross was hoisted into place, silhouetted against a prairie horizon so vast it seemed to swallow time itself. Inside the wire, men knelt on their knees, praying in Italian, their voices carried off by the same wind that rattled the sentry towers above. Not all Americans were pleased. Some questioned why enemies were allowed such freedom, but officers recognized the value of morale, discipline, and the Geneva obligation to treat prisoners humanely. In a camp of over 6,000 men, a project that kept hands busy and hearts anchored was worth the effort. Decades later, in 1988 and again in 1989, former prisoners returned. Old men now, they touched the stone walls they had laid as boys and wept openly. They found the graves of those who had never left Texas and knelt in prayer once more. Their work, born of captivity, had endured long after the war's guns fell silent. That evening in 1944, Carlo ran his hand along the cool stone, its permanence a comfort. He thought of home, of a war that had shattered nations, and of this unlikely gift. A church in Texas dust, built by defeated soldiers, sanctioned by their captors, sanctified by faith. Boston in winter carried a different kind of bite. Salt air stung the nostrils, and the docks clanged with chains as cargo shifted in the cold. Yet for men of the Italian service units, weekends promised something extraordinary. A pass beyond the wire. Under supervision and strict curfews, they were allowed into the city, not as prisoners in rags, but in clean U.S. uniforms marked by the Italy arc on their shoulders. The first time Carlo stepped into South Station, he could hardly breathe. The station roared with locomotives, polished soldiers on leave, and families bundled in wool. He clutched his pass like a passport to another world. At a parish hall in the North End, long tables were set with pasta, bread, and bottles of Chianti procured by Italian-American families. Volunteers like Mary Donahue, whose brother served with the 1st Infantry Division in France, welcomed the POWs with handshakes and steaming plates. Conversation bridged the gulf between captor and captive. In halting English and with gestures, Carlo explained his village in Abruzzo, his family's hunger, the empty shelves. Mary responded with stories of rationing at home, meatless Tuesdays, gasoline coupons. But even those limitations seemed lavish compared to Italy's 225 grams of bread per day, soon threatened to fall to 150. The contrast hung unspoken between them. In America, even during war, abundance was the norm. After dinner, the men lingered. Some played music, others danced. The parish choir sang hymns that blurred languages, Latin and English rising together beneath the vaulted ceiling. For a few hours, the prisoners forgot the wire, the guards, and the shame of defeat. They were men among families, welcomed at tables that mirrored their own across the ocean. These weekend passes were not charity alone. They were policy, designed to encourage loyalty, to soften the bitterness of captivity, and to show the Italians what democratic abundance looked like in practice. It worked. Reports noted discipline improved, escape attempts dwindled, and morale remained high. The Italians saw firsthand that America was not just wealthier in machines and food, but in spirit. As Carlo walked back to the docks that night, snow beginning to fall, he tucked a small gift into his pocket, a paper cup of coffee, still warm. He sipped it slowly, savoring the taste, knowing his sister back in Abruzzo had likely gone to bed hungry. He whispered a prayer that one day she too would know such warmth. The gates closed behind him, but something had shifted. Captivity no longer felt like defeat. It felt like initiation into a world that had more to offer than victory alone. It offered hope. The Indiana sun rose golden over endless rows of wheat as the prisoners filed into the fields. The air carried the rich scent of damp soil, mingled with the oily tang of machinery. For Carlo Benedetti, assigned to a farm crew from Camp Atterbury, this was unlike any harvest he had ever known. Back home in Abruzzo, a mule and a wooden plow were still considered modern. Here, the Americans unleashed steel giants. Farmers guided combines across the fields, the roar of their engines drowning birdsong. Belts turned, blades spun, and grain poured into waiting trucks with mechanical precision. Each pass of a harvester reaped more than Carlo's village could gather in a week. To him, it felt like watching time accelerate, centuries of toil compressed into hours. The Italians worked alongside, hauling, stacking, and laboring where hands were still needed. But the machines carried the burden, multiplying every effort tenfold. The statistics defied belief. Even as millions of Americans fought overseas, U.S. farms set records. By 1944, wheat production reached over 1.1 billion bushels. Labor shortages were real, yet solved through ingenuity. Machines, women in the fields, and unexpectedly, POWs. In Indiana alone, thousands of Italians bent their backs to the harvest, filling a gap left by sons at the front. For Sergeant William Harlan, who had grown up driving tractors on Kansas soil before climbing into the turret of a Sherman, the scene was familiar and foreign at once. He saw in these POWs a mirror, men tied to the land, bound by duty, yet now wielding American machines. Watching them work reminded him why he fought. If America's fields could yield this bounty, then the arsenal of democracy was not just steel and oil, it was bread. Carlo paused during a break, wiping sweat from his brow. He held a kernel of wheat between his fingers, marveling at its perfection. In his village, such grains were hoarded, stretched with sawdust, to make bread that barely fed a family. Here, the abundance was so great that he had seen entire sacks spill onto the ground, swept up and discarded without alarm. That waste alone exceeded what his neighbors would eat in weeks. When the day ended, the POWs were given their ration: bread, meat, even butter. Carlo ate slowly, savoring every bite, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. America's wealth was not myth. It grew from the soil itself, harvested by machines that seemed tireless, powered by fuel that never ran out. As twilight settled, the fields stood stripped and orderly, like soldiers in formation awaiting orders. Carlo understood. This harvest was not just food, it was victory, transformed into energy for armies that marched across Europe. Far from the fields of Indiana, in the roar of Detroit's factories, another harvest was underway, one of steel, rubber, and fire. Sparks cascaded like fireworks as welders stitched armor plates together. Conveyors rattled, cranes swung, and the clamor of hammers on rivets created a music of war. The M4 Sherman tank, America's armored workhorse, rolled off assembly lines at a pace no enemy could match. The numbers were staggering. By 1945, more than 49,000 Shermans had been built, more tanks of a single type than Italy had produced of all models combined during the entire war. Where Mussolini's workshops eked out a few hundred M1340s or M1441s, Detroit turned out thousands of Shermans, each with a 75mm gun, 5-man crew, and enough spare parts to keep it fighting indefinitely. The impossible statistic became clear. One U.S. factory in a single month could outproduce Italy's entire armored fleet. It wasn't just tanks. Liberty ships launched daily from coastal yards, their 441-foot hulls sliding into rivers and oceans to carry the war across continents. Aircraft plants delivered B-24 Liberators at a rate of 1 per hour. Petroleum gushed from American wells, 5.2 million barrels per day by late 1944, fueling vehicles, planes, and the mechanization of farms. Aluminum production swelled so high that surpluses piled unused, a luxury unthinkable to Axis powers who scavenged wreckage for scraps. Back in Boston, Carlo Benedetti saw this abundance distilled in microcosm. On the docks, crates of spare parts sat stacked to the rafters. When one broke open, workers tossed bent pieces aside as waste. He picked up a discarded wrench, turning it in his hand, struck by the thought that back in Abruzzo, such a tool might have been shared by a dozen families for years. Here, America discarded more than Italy had ever possessed. For German commanders, intelligence reports of such capacity were demoralizing. How could a nation whose factories produced in a day what others managed in months ever be beaten? For Italians like Carlo, the revelation was more intimate. The war had taught him hunger, scarcity, and defeat. America showed him plenitude, machinery that multiplied human effort, and the casual confidence of a people who believed abundance was their birthright. Shift changes echoed through the factory, whistles blaring as workers filed out and fresh crews took their place. Tanks rumbled onto flat cars, bound for ports where Italians in ISUS would help load them onto ships. It was a cycle without end: production, transport, deployment, victory. Watching crates of weapons vanish into the belly of a freighter, Carlo realized he was glimpsing something greater than armies. This was not merely a war fought with rifles and tanks. It was a war won by factories, farms, and an inexhaustible will to supply the front until no enemy remained standing. The Boston docks in the summer of 1944 hummed with a rhythm that seemed endless. Cranes clattered overhead, winches groaned, and boxcars screeched on iron rails as they delivered the cargo of war. Among the men bending their backs under the weight of crates were prisoners in American uniforms stitched with a curious identifier: Italy. They were no longer Mussolini's soldiers, but members of Italian service units, their loyalty redirected, their hands now fueling the war machine they once opposed. A Christian Science Monitor reporter, escorted through the docks that August, watched in astonishment as these former enemies labored with discipline and pride. His notes would record them as working industriously, willingly, and intelligently. Brigadier General Calvin DeWitt, Boston's quartermaster commander, was more blunt. Their performance was more than satisfactory, and their labor badly needed. These were not polite compliments. The United States faced a labor shortage, with millions of young men deployed overseas. Every Italian who carried a crate freed an American soldier to fire a rifle in France. The statistics revealed the scale. By war's end, more than 45,000 Italian POWs in America had volunteered for ISUs. Collectively, they delivered over 90 million man-days of labor, an economic value exceeding $230 million. They unloaded ammunition, stocked depots, harvested crops, and even worked in hospitals. From Boston to Texas, their contribution was woven into the Allied effort, invisible to the public but vital to victory. Carlo Benedetti knew the irony intimately. Only a year before, he had aimed his Carcano rifle at Americans in Tunisia. Now he handled crates of Garand rifles, ammunition belts, and even cases of Hershey bars destined for the same soldiers he once fought. Each box he lifted tightened the knot of contradiction in his chest. He was a prisoner, yet he had become part of the American arsenal. At dusk, as another Liberty ship's horn bellowed across the harbor, Carlo paused to watch it slide from its berth. Its hold was filled with the very cargo he and his fellows had stacked. Somewhere across the Atlantic, those supplies would reach men preparing to storm Fortress Europe. He understood then that surrender had not ended his war. It had transformed it. He was no longer fighting, but he was still part of the campaign that would decide the world's future. The reporter closed his notebook. He had expected to find captives in chains. Instead, he found willing laborers woven into America's supply system. It was a revelation. The United States had not only defeated its enemies, it had absorbed them into its machinery of victory. December 1945 brought biting wind to Boston Harbor. The war was over, victory secured, and now came the task of emptying the camps. Italian service unit men lined the pier in ranks, each carrying a small duffel and the weight of inevitability. Geneva Convention rules were clear. Prisoners of war had to be repatriated without delay. Yet as the ships loomed with their smokestacks rising against the gray sky, a quiet desperation spread through the ranks. Many of the men did not want to leave. Carlo Benedetti clutched his pass, staring at the ship that would return him to Naples. He remembered the letters from home. Bread rations reduced to 225 grams per day, rumors of cuts to 150, families scavenging for firewood in bombed-out ruins. Italy was starving, its cities shattered, its government fragile. Here in America, even as a prisoner, he had eaten meat, drunk coffee, and pocketed candy bars from a camp canteen. He had worked with machines that made scarcity seem like a relic of another century. To return was to embrace hunger again. Some men whispered petitions, asking parish priests or American supervisors if there was any way to stay. Local families who had welcomed them to Sunday dinners wrote letters on their behalf. The answer was always the same. It was impossible. America could not keep them without violating international law. The barbed wire had not been permanent, but neither could their place within the arsenal of democracy. Mary Donahue stood on the pier with a group of parish volunteers, watching the men board. She spotted Carlo in the line and raised her hand. He managed a wave, his duffel heavy, but his expression heavier still. Their conversations over pasta and coffee replayed in his mind, her brother still serving in Europe, her generosity to men once branded enemies. In another world, perhaps he might have stayed, found work, and made a life among the people who had shown him such kindness. The horn blasted low and mournful, echoing across the harbor. Gangways clattered as men filed aboard. Guards barked orders, though gently, for they knew these were not hostile prisoners, but reluctant exiles. The Statue of Liberty would vanish behind them as it had greeted them 2 years before, a silent witness to their passage. Carlo turned once more to the city skyline, its cranes and smokestacks rising in defiance of the winter gloom. It was a vision of abundance he would carry back to a land of scarcity. As the ship eased away from the pier, he whispered a vow. If life allowed, he would return. For America had shown him not just defeat, but a future worth yearning for. The ship eased into Naples in early 1946, its hull streaked with rust, its passengers silent with dread. Carlo Benedetti stepped onto the dock and was struck by the smell, not of diesel or coffee, as in Boston, but of smoke from burned timbers and the acrid stench of decay. The city lay broken, its buildings gutted, its streets pocked with rubble. Children with hollow eyes begged for crusts of bread, their hands thin as twigs. He had returned to Italy, but not to the Italy he had left. The ration cards confirmed what letters had warned. Bread allocations had fallen to 225 grams per day, and rumors of a reduction to 150 grams haunted every household. Where in America crates of food were stacked to the rafters, here bakeries shuttered early, their shelves bare before noon. Families stretched meals with chestnuts, wild greens, even sawdust mixed into flour. Benedetti recalled the evenings in Boston when he had eaten pasta, buttered bread, and coffee after a day's work. The contrast cut deeper than hunger itself. He carried with him tokens of captivity, a bar of soap stamped with American lettering, a photograph of the chapel at Hereford, and a postcard Mary Donahue had given him of Boston's skyline. These were not trinkets, but talismans of another world. His comrades felt the same. Many spoke openly of return, of somehow finding a path back across the ocean, not as prisoners but as immigrants. For them, America was no longer the enemy. It had become a promise. Meanwhile, in Kansas, Sergeant William Harlan read news of Italy's famine in the local paper. He thought of the POWs he had seen in the fields, their diligence under the hot sun. America had already moved to help. Ships laden with grain were crossing the Atlantic, part of the relief that would evolve into the Marshall Plan. Once again, abundance was a weapon, bread and flour joining tanks and bombers as tools of American power. Benedetti found work when he could, repairing tools, carrying loads, but his mind often wandered back to the Boston docks. He remembered the ship horns, the smell of diesel, the sheer scale of machinery that dwarfed all hardship. His family survived, but only just. The war was over, yet the struggle for bread continued. One evening, as he unfolded the photograph of the Hereford Chapel, he traced the outline of the stone cross with his finger. In the silence of his ruined home, he whispered a prayer that one day he might return to the land where even captivity had felt like freedom. Decades passed. The chapel at Hereford, weathered by wind and time, still stood against the Texas sky. In 1988, a group of gray-haired men stepped onto its grounds. They were no longer young prisoners, but veterans of a strange captivity. Some leaned on canes, others clutched rosaries. All carried memories heavy as stone. They touched the walls they had built with blistered hands, their voices breaking as they prayed for comrades buried in the camp cemetery. For Carlo Benedetti, who had managed to emigrate years earlier, the return was both triumph and grief. He walked the chapel's aisles slowly, recalling the sweat and dust of 1944 when he had cut stone under guard. Now, no guards remained, only memory and gratitude. He knelt, giving thanks not for victory or defeat, but for the humanity shown to him in a time of war. The legacy of those Italian service units stretched beyond this chapel. Their 90 million man-days of labor had saved the U.S. Army an estimated $230 million, freeing tens of thousands of Americans to fight across Europe and the Pacific. In purely military terms, their contribution was immense, an army of prisoners turned into a workforce that amplified the arsenal of democracy. But their true legacy was more subtle. They had discovered firsthand that freedom's abundance was stronger than tyranny's promise. Impossible statistics underscored the lesson. One U.S. factory in Detroit could outproduce Italy's entire wartime tank fleet in a single month. By late 1944, American petroleum output reached 5.2 million barrels per day, more fuel in a week than Italy could refine in a year. Even in POW camps, Italians had seen cigarettes distributed by the carton, spare parts burned as waste, chocolate bars stacked higher than their families' bread rations. They had glimpsed the full measure of industrial democracy, and it had remade their loyalties. Some returned to America through marriage or immigration, building new lives as farmers, machinists, and citizens. Others carried only memories, letters exchanged with American families who had once welcomed them on weekend passes. All of them bore witness to a truth. America's strength was not cruelty or conquest, but abundance, generosity, and an unshakable belief in production as power. As the sun dipped behind the Texas horizon, Carlo stepped outside the chapel. The wind rustled through the mesquite, carrying the faint echo of a Sherman's rumble, the clang of a Boston crane, the whistle of an Indiana harvester. He closed his eyes and smiled. Captivity had begun in defeat, but it ended in revelation. America had shown him that a nation could win not only with bullets and tanks, but with bread, steel, and compassion.